The radio didn't click on so much as it sighed awake. A soft wash of static filled the room, the kind that sounded like wind combing through tall grass, or fingers brushing across an old wool coat. Somewhere beneath it, a clock ticked, slow, deliberate, almost tired. Outside, the night pressed its weight against the window panes, and the glass answered with a faint, restless rattle. "Welcome back," the voice said gently, low and unhurried. "You've tuned into dread shadow." A pause. The static breathed. "While the rest of the world is raising glasses and shouting into the cold, you're here. Awake. Listening. Keeping quiet company with the dark." Another pause, long enough to make the listener wonder if the voice had drifted away. "Tonight, we're not talking about new beginnings. We're talking about things that refuse to end. Moments that get stuck. Roads that loop back on themselves. Faces that don't stay where they belong." The clock ticked again. "So pull the blanket a little higher. Turn the volume just loud enough to hear your own breathing, because the next 3 stories might make you wish that the clock never quite reaches 12. The static deepened. "And we'll begin on a frozen highway." Story 1: The Hitchhiker's Resolution. The mile marker appeared out of the snow like a crooked tooth. Mile 147. Evan noticed it only because his headlights caught the reflective numbers at the last possible second, the white rectangle flashing past the windshield before vanishing back into the storm. He didn't remember passing 148. Or 149. He told himself that didn't mean anything. Snowstorms had a way of compressing distance, of folding long stretches of road into something tight and breathless. The interstate had been empty for over an hour. No taillights ahead. No headlights behind. Just the steady, muted hiss of tires grinding against packed ice and the low whine of wind forcing its way through the seams of the car. The radio cycled uselessly through static and half-formed voices, countdowns from distant cities, fragments of music, someone laughing before the signal dissolved again. Evan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The leather felt colder than it should have, even through his gloves. He flexed his fingers once, then again, trying to keep the stiffness away. The dashboard clock glowed a dull green. 11:23 p.m. Plenty of time, he told himself. If the storm didn't get worse. If the road crews had done their job. If. A gust of wind shoved the car sideways. Evan sucked in a sharp breath and corrected, heart thudding once, hard enough that he felt it in his throat. The tires protested with a hollow crunch, then found purchase again. He eased off the accelerator, letting the speed bleed down until the engine's hum dropped into a lower, steadier register. "Easy," he muttered, though there was no one to hear him. The Midwest at night had a way of making a person talk to themselves. Too much dark. Too much space. Too few landmarks to anchor your thoughts. The snow thickened, flakes streaking diagonally across the windshield, illuminated in brief, ghostly flashes by the headlights. Evan flicked the wipers up another notch. They scraped rhythmically, pushing aside the accumulating frost, leaving behind brief arcs of clarity before the glass clouded over again. He leaned forward slightly, peering into the white blur ahead. That was when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow thrown sideways by the uneven drifts. The storm liked to make shapes where there were none, figures that dissolved the moment you looked at them directly. But this shape didn't dissolve. It stood just beyond the right lane, half turned toward the road, as if waiting for something to approach. The headlights caught it fully now, resolving into a human silhouette. A woman. Evan's foot lifted from the accelerator without conscious thought. The car slowed, tires whispering uneasily over the ice. She wasn't moving. She stood with her back straight, shoulders squared against the wind, dark hair plastered to her face by snow and sleet. She wore jeans and thin sneakers, the kind meant for dry pavement and heated rooms. No coat. No hat. Her arms were bare, skin already flushed a raw, unnatural red from the cold. In her hands, she held a camera. An old one, bulky, rectangular, with a thick strap looped around her wrist. A small red light glowed on its side. Recording. Evan's first coherent thought was that she shouldn't be alive. The second was that if he kept driving, he would be. His pulse hammered in his ears as he eased the car onto the shoulder. Gravel crunched faintly beneath the snowpack. He flicked on the hazard lights, the orange blinks cutting weakly through the storm. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at her through the windshield. She didn't wave. Didn't step forward. Didn't give any sign that she'd noticed the car at all. The camera remained fixed, lens pointed directly at him. Jesus, Evan breathed. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights bearing down on him, some unseen truck about to turn this act of kindness into a headline. The mirror showed only darkness and swirling white. He rolled the window down an inch. Cold air knifed in immediately, sharp and metallic, carrying with it the faint, clean scent of snow and something else, old oil, maybe, or damp plastic. "Hey," he called, raising his voice over the wind. "Are you okay?" The woman turned her head slowly. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue. Snow clung to her eyelashes in delicate, crystalline clumps. Her eyes were open wide, unblinking, reflecting the headlights like dull glass. She didn't answer. The camera shifted slightly in her grip, recentering its focus. Evan swallowed. "You can't stand out here," he said, trying again. "You'll freeze." Still nothing. He hesitated, a familiar internal argument flaring to life. Every warning he'd ever heard surfaced at once: don't pick up strangers, especially at night, especially in storms like this. People staged accidents. People lied. People disappeared. But then he looked at her shoes again. At her bare arms. At the way the wind seemed to pass straight through her without eliciting even a shiver. Compassion won. He killed the engine and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing the breath from his lungs. Snow immediately found its way down the collar of his jacket, melting against the warmth of his skin. He slammed the door shut behind him and crunched his way toward her, boots slipping slightly on the ice beneath the drifts. Up close, she looked even worse. Her skin had a waxy quality to it, stretched too tight over her cheekbones. Her fingers were stiff around the camera, knuckles white, as if she'd been holding it for a very long time. "You need to get in the car," Evan said, more firmly now. "I can take you to the next exit. There's a gas station." She turned the camera fully toward him. The lens whirred softly, adjusting. The red light blinked once, then steadied. Evan felt a strange, crawling sensation at the base of his spine, the uncomfortable awareness of being watched, catalogued. "Are you filming me?" he asked. Her lips parted. For a second, he thought she was going to speak. He leaned in slightly, straining to hear over the wind. Instead, she lifted her free hand and pointed, not at him, but at the open passenger door. Evan exhaled a shaky laugh. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Yeah. Let's get you warm." She moved stiffly, joints protesting with each step, and slid into the passenger seat without a word. Snow dusted the upholstery where she brushed against it. The camera never wavered, its lens fixed on Evan even as he circled back to the driver's side. He climbed in and shut the door, sealing them both into the small, insulated bubble of the car. The heater kicked in with a low groan, blasting air that felt lukewarm at best. Evan started the engine. The woman sat perfectly still, posture rigid, camera resting in her lap, still recording. Meltwater pooled beneath her shoes, spreading slowly across the floor mat. "You're really cold," Evan said, glancing at her hands. "You should." He stopped. She was looking at him. Not at his face. At the reflection of his face, faintly visible in the glossy black surface of the camera's display screen, her expression was unreadable. Not fear. Not relief. Something closer to anticipation. Evan turned his eyes back to the road and pulled onto the highway. The storm swallowed them whole. Behind the steady scrape of the wipers and the hum of the engine, another sound emerged, soft, irregular, like the faint hiss of an old cassette tape spinning in an empty deck. Evan frowned. The camera's red light blinked again. And somewhere, deep beneath the sound of the storm, the clock on the dashboard ticked closer to midnight. The road narrowed in Evan's perception, not physically. There were still 2 lanes cutting through the white nothing, but mentally, as if the storm had reached inside his skull and pulled the world inward. The headlights carved out a short, trembling tunnel ahead, and everything beyond it ceased to exist. The woman didn't move. She sat with her knees together, feet flat on the floor, the camera resting against her thighs like a sleeping animal. Meltwater crept outward from her shoes, darkening the carpet in an irregular bloom. Evan found himself watching that puddle instead of her face, as if looking directly at her for too long might invite something he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. The heater whined, then settled into a steady breath. Warm air brushed his knuckles, but his fingers still felt numb, stiff on the steering wheel. "You're, he began, then stopped. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. "What's your name? Where are you coming from? Why are you filming me in the middle of a blizzard like this is normal?" He tried again. "There's an exit about 15 miles up. We can get you inside somewhere. You shouldn't be out here." The woman didn't respond. Her gaze drifted, not to him, but to the windshield, to the snow rushing toward them in endless, identical streaks. The camera's lens remained angled upward, catching his reflection in its dark glass. Evan cleared his throat. "Do you need help calling someone?" "Nothing." A faint sound rose in the car, barely audible at first. A thin, uneven whisper, like wind slipping through a cracked door. Evan frowned. He reached for the radio knob and turned it down, then off. The static vanished, but the sound remained. It took him a few seconds to realize it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the camera. A low mechanical hiss, punctuated by soft, rhythmic clicks. The sound of tape moving over old, tired spools. RRR, CHHK, RRR, CHHK. Evan glanced sideways. "Is that thing recording on tape?" The woman's fingers tightened around the camera's grip. The red light pulsed once, slow and deliberate. A flicker of irritation cut through his unease. "Hey. I'm serious. I didn't pick you up so you could." He stopped mid-sentence. On the camera's flip-out display, his reflection shifted. At first, it was subtle enough that he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The angle was wrong. The lighting didn't match the car's interior. The image wavered slightly, colors washed thin and gray, as if filtered through decades of dust. Then he noticed the lid. The wooden lid. The frame was tight, claustrophobic, a rectangle of space barely wider than shoulders. The walls were lined with pale satin, quilted in neat, funereal diamonds. And centered in the shot, lying perfectly still, hands folded over his chest, was Evan. His breath caught so sharply it hurt. "No," he whispered, before he could stop himself. The car drifted slightly toward the center line. He jerked the wheel back, heart slamming hard enough that his vision sparked at the edges. He leaned closer to the camera display, his foot easing off the accelerator without conscious command. The image sharpened. The face in the coffin was unmistakably his. Same faint scar along the chin from a childhood bike accident. Same uneven eyebrows. Same tired crease between them that had deepened over the past few years. The eyes were closed. The skin had a grayish cast, drained of warmth, lips pressed together in a thin, resigned line. Someone, something, had dressed him carefully, buttoning a dark suit up to his throat. Evan's stomach rolled. "That's not funny," he said hoarsely. "Turn that off." The woman finally turned her head toward him. Up close, her eyes looked wrong. Too reflective. too still. Like mirrors that hadn't been dusted in a long time. She didn't speak. The tape hissed on. The image shifted again. The coffin lid lowered slowly into frame. Wood met wood with a soft, final sound. Darkness swallowed the picture, replaced by the faint outline of fabric and the suggestion of cramped space. Then, movement. The camera angle changed abruptly, jostling as if someone had picked it up in a hurry. The view burst back into light, this time from a low angle, tilted. Snow whipped past. Headlights flared. A stretch of highway unfurled ahead, slick with ice, framed by snowbanks that rose like walls on either side. Evan recognized it instantly. Mile 147. The tape skipped. The image stuttered, then resumed. A car entered the frame from the left, his car. Same make. Same dented rear bumper. Same faint crack in the windshield that he'd never quite gotten around to fixing. The camera followed as the car hit a patch of black ice. The footage shook violently. Headlights swerved. Tires screamed, a sound Evan felt in his bones even though it wasn't actually there. The car spun. Once. Twice. Then the guardrail loomed, metal flashing white beneath the snow. Impact. The screen exploded into chaos. The sound spiked into a distorted shriek of tearing metal and shattering glass. The image went briefly black, then returned in brief, nauseating flashes, crumpled steel, a slack hand on a steering wheel, blood blooming dark against snow. Evan gagged. "Stop," he gasped, fumbling for the camera. "Stop it." The woman twisted away from him with surprising strength, clutching the camera to her chest. The image steadied. The red light glowed steadily. The tape played on. Evan's hands shook so badly he nearly missed the road again. His foot hovered over the brake, instinct screaming at him to slow down, to pull over, to get away from whatever nightmare had just crawled into his car. But another instinct, older, colder, held him frozen in motion. "If I stop." He didn't finish the thought. "How did you get that?" he demanded, his voice thin and sharp. "That hasn't happened." The woman tilted her head slightly, considering him. Snowmelt dripped from her hair onto the seat, each drop loud in a tense quiet. Slowly, deliberately, she raised one finger. She pointed at the dashboard clock. 11:41 p.m. Evan followed her gaze, dread coiling tighter with each second that ticked past. "That's not," he swallowed. "That's not real. It's just some kind of sick joke." The tape responded with a soft click. The image on the display shifted again. This time, the camera was inside the car. Inside this car. The angle was wrong, too low, too close, as if the camera were resting on the passenger seat, angled up toward the driver. Toward Evan. He stared at himself on the screen, mirrored down to the smallest detail. The tension in his jaw. The white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. The flicker of fear he hadn't quite managed to hide. The Evan on the screen glanced sideways. At the passenger seat. At the woman. The Evan in the present did the same thing at the exact same moment. A cold sweat broke out along his spine. "This is impossible," he whispered. The woman's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. The tape hissed louder now, filling the car with its uneven breathing. Beneath it, another sound emerged, a faint, distant chorus of voices, layered and indistinct, as if picked up from a far-off broadcast. 10. 9. The countdown was warped, stretched thin and uneven, voices overlapping, some too slow, others too fast. Evan shook his head violently, as if he could dislodge the sound. "I'm taking you to the next exit," he said. "You can get out there. I don't care what you do after that." He pressed harder on the accelerator. The car surged forward, tires skidding briefly before catching again. The storm thickened in response, snow hammering against the windshield in dense, blinding sheets. The woman didn't protest. Instead, she reached forward with one stiff finger and tapped the camera's control panel. The image jumped. Now it showed the highway from above, an impossible angle, as if the camera were floating high in the storm. Evan's car was a small, fragile thing below, a lone set of headlights cutting a trembling line through the snow. The timestamp blinked in the corner of the screen. 11:58 p.m. Evan's chest tightened painfully. "That's not right," he said. "That's not now." The woman's eyes flicked to the clock again. 11:43 p.m. The tape skipped. The timestamp jumped. 11:59 p.m. The car on the screen began to drift. "No," Evan breathed. "No, no, no." He slammed his foot onto the brake. The tires screamed. The world lurched. The woman vanished. 1 second she was there, pale and dripping meltwater onto the seat. The next, the passenger side was empty. The camera clattered against the floor, skidding forward until it bumped against the dashboard with a hollow thunk. Evan's car slid to a stop at an angle across the shoulder, hazard lights blinking uselessly into the storm. Silence fell, sudden and oppressive. Evan sat there, chest heaving, staring at the empty seat beside him. His breath fogged the air, blooming white and then fading. "Hello?" he croaked. No answer. The only sound was the soft tick of cooling metal and the distant howl of the wind. Slowly, carefully, Evan reached down and picked up the camera. It was heavier than he expected. Solid. Real. The red light still glowed. With trembling fingers, he turned the display back toward himself. The image showed the highway ahead. Clear. Empty. And on the bottom corner of the screen, the timestamp blinked once. 12 a.m. The tape hissed. And began to rewind. The rewinding sound was worse than the crash. It crawled backward through the car in an uneven whine, a mechanical groan that felt intimate, invasive, like someone rifling through Evan's memories without permission. The tape spun faster, then faster still, the hiss rising in pitch until it bordered on a scream. Evan snapped the camera shut. The sound died instantly. For several seconds, he sat frozen, the camera clutched against his chest, hazard lights pulsing weakly through the snow. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, loud enough to drown out the wind. "This isn't real," he told himself. "This can't be real." He forced a shaky breath through his nose and glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:48 p.m. 12 minutes to midnight. The discrepancy hit him like a physical blow. "That's not possible," he muttered. His voice sounded wrong in the enclosed space, too loud, too thin. It said 12. It already. He stopped. The camera vibrated faintly in his hands. A soft click echoed from inside it, followed by the familiar hiss of tape engaging. Evan stared down at it. "I didn't," he swallowed. "I didn't turn you on." The red light blinked once. Then steadied. Against every instinct screaming at him to throw the thing out the window, Evan flipped the display open again. The image showed the inside of his car. Not the car as it was now, angled on the shoulder, engine idling, hazard lights blinking, but the car in motion. Snow streamed past the windshield in steady, hypnotic lines. The steering wheel was centered. The speedometer needle hovered just above 50. Evan glanced up at the real dashboard. 0. The image on the camera lurched. The road ahead curved gently to the left. Evan's stomach tightened. He knew that curve. It came just after mile 147, a long, shallow bend where the road dipped slightly before straightening out again. Harmless in clear weather. Deadly when ice settled in the wrong places. On the screen, his hands tightened on the wheel. In real life, his fingers twitched in sympathetic response. "No," he whispered. "I stopped. I didn't crash." The tape ignored him. The camera's perspective shifted again, snapping to a tight shot of the dashboard clock. 11:49 p.m. The digits flickered, then advanced. 11:50, Evan's breathing quickened. "You're wrong," he said, louder now, as if volume alone might assert control. "You're out of order. That already happened." He cut himself off as a new image bled onto the screen. The woman. She stood on the shoulder of the road, framed by swirling snow, her dark hair whipping around her face. The camera zoomed in slowly, deliberately. She was smiling. Not wide. Not cruel. Just a small, knowing curve of the lips, as if she were watching a familiar scene play out exactly as expected. Evan's pulse stuttered. "You left," he said hoarsely. "You're gone." The woman on the screen raised her hand. Pointed. Not at Evan. At the road. The image snapped back to the windshield view. The curve loomed closer. Evan squeezed his eyes shut for a second, then opened them again, heart hammering. The real road ahead was empty, quiet, his car still safely at rest on the shoulder. "I didn't crash," he told himself. "I changed it." But doubt crept in around the edges of that thought, cold and persistent. "Did I?" The camera trembled in his hands, as if eager to be seen. He lowered it slightly, forcing himself to look away from the screen and out at the storm. Snow fell thick and heavy now, the world reduced to a narrow cone of visibility. The hazard lights blinked on and off, each flash briefly illuminating the drifts around him before plunging them back into darkness. A realization settled slowly, like frost forming on glass. He couldn't stay here. The shoulder felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable. Every second he sat still was a second the storm could worsen, a second another vehicle could lose control and slide into him without warning. And worse, every second he sat still was a second the camera could decide to show him something else. Evan set his jaw. "Okay," he said, voice trembling but resolute. "Okay. We're not doing this." He placed the camera face down on the passenger seat, as far from his line of sight as possible. The red light continued to glow, reflected faintly in the dark fabric. Ignoring it took effort. He took one last look at the dashboard clock. 11:51 p.m. 11 minutes. Evan eased the car back into gear and pulled onto the highway. The tires protested, slipping briefly before finding traction. The car straightened out, headlights cutting through the snow once more. As soon as the vehicle was in motion, the camera reacted. The hiss returned, louder now, layered with faint distortions, pops, warbles, fragments of sound that didn't belong together. 5. 8. 2. The countdown voices bled together, warped and asynchronous, like recordings played back at the wrong speed. Evan pressed his lips together, focusing on the road. He kept his speed low, well below what he knew the limit was. Every movement of the steering wheel was careful, deliberate. "You don't control this," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to anymore. "I do." The woman's voice answered him. It came not from the seat beside him, but from the camera. Soft. Close. Almost gentle. "You already did." Evan's blood ran cold. He flicked a glance at the passenger seat. It was empty. The camera lay exactly where he'd put it, face down, strap coiled loosely around it like a discarded snake. "I'm not listening to you," he said, forcing the words out. "You're not real." The camera clicked. On instinct, Evan glanced down. The display had turned itself back on. The image showed him driving. Only this time, the perspective was wrong. It wasn't from the passenger seat. It wasn't from anywhere inside the car. It was from the back seat. Centered. Steady. As if someone were sitting there, watching him. Evan's throat tightened painfully. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He didn't want to confirm what his body already seemed to know. On the screen, the timestamp blinked. 11:53 p.m. The Evan on the screen glanced into the rearview mirror. His eyes widened. His hands jerked on the wheel. In the real car, Evan felt the urge to do the same, to check, just once, to see if someone was there. He resisted. "I'm not going to look," he whispered. "You can't make me." The woman's voice returned, closer now, layered with faint static. "You promised," she said. "I never promised you anything." The tape hissed sharply, like a breath drawn through clenched teeth. The image on the screen froze, then rewound a few seconds. Played again. Rewound. Played again. Each time, the Evan on the screen looked closer to panic, his movements more frantic, his breathing more ragged. Evan's chest ached as if the same fear were being siphoned out of him and poured into the recording. The dashboard clock advanced. 11:55 p.m. Sweat beaded along Evan's hairline despite the cold. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, palms slick. The road curved again, gently. Not that curve. Another one. Familiar, but not the one he feared. On the screen, the woman's face appeared briefly in the rearview mirror, pale and serene. "You said you'd take me with you," she murmured. "You always do." A horrible understanding began to form, slow and heavy. "How many times?" Evan asked quietly. "How many times has this happened?" The camera didn't answer directly. Instead, the image cut to a different angle. The coffin. Again. But this time, Evan's eyes were open. Wide. Aware. The timestamp in the corner of the screen flickered, 11:59 p.m. Evan's breath hitched. "No," he whispered. "I won't." The woman's face filled the screen. Her eyes were kind. "You already are." The car hit a patch of ice. Evan felt the wheels lose traction, the sickening weightlessness as the vehicle began to slide. Time stretched, elastic and fragile. The dashboard clock ticked over. 11:56 p.m. 4 minutes. Evan corrected gently, easing into the skid the way he'd been taught years ago. The car wobbled, fishtailed. Then straightened. His breath left him in a sob of relief. "I changed it," he gasped. "You're wrong." The camera was silent. For a moment, just a moment, Evan thought he'd won. Then the camera spoke again, this time in his own voice. Calm. Recorded. Familiar. "There's an exit about 15 miles up," the voice said. "We can get you inside somewhere." Evan stared at the screen. The image showed the moment he'd first stopped on the shoulder. The woman stood in the snow, camera raised. The timestamp read 11:23 p.m. The loop closed, the dashboard clock advanced. 11:57 p.m. 3 minutes remained. The road seemed to narrow again as midnight drew closer, not because the lanes physically constricted, but because Evan's attention could no longer afford to wander even an inch beyond what was directly ahead of him, every sense stretched taut as if the storm itself were pulling him forward by the sternum, the headlights illuminating only a short, fragile ribbon of asphalt while the rest of the world dissolved into a formless white void, and somewhere beneath the steady grind of the tires and the rhythmic scrape of the wipers, the camera continued to breathe, its faint mechanical hiss threading through the car like a second, unwelcome pulse. Evan no longer bothered pretending it wasn't there, because denial required energy he didn't have, and because the thing had made one truth painfully clear: it did not need his permission to exist, to record, to remember, so instead he focused on the road, on the feel of the steering wheel vibrating faintly under his palms, on the way his shoulders ached from being held too rigid for too long, and on the clock, that small rectangle of glowing numbers that now seemed to dominate the entire dashboard, 11:57 p.m. burning into his vision with a cruel steadiness, every second that passed sounding louder than the last, each tick less like a measurement of time and more like a footstep approaching from behind. The storm intensified in response. Or perhaps it had always been this bad and only now did his fear allow him to truly feel it. The wind rising to a low, constant howl that pressed against the car as if testing its resolve, snow slamming sideways into the windshield in dense sheets that erased the horizon entirely, and in that isolation Evan began to understand what the woman had meant, not in words, because she had rarely used those, but in implication, in repetition, in the quiet certainty of her presence. That this road was not simply a place where something terrible happened, it was a place where something kept happening, a thin scar in the world where time bent just enough to fold back on itself, and the camera was not predicting the future so much as insisting upon a memory that refused to fade. His mind returned, unbidden, to the first moment he had seen her standing by the mile marker, the way she hadn't waved or called out, the way she had simply waited as if she already knew the outcome. And with a sickening clarity Evan realized that his act of compassion, the choice he had always been proud of, when he thought back on it in the years since, had not been an interruption to the loop but its ignition, the moment the cycle sealed itself closed, because the promise hadn't been spoken aloud, it had been implied in the opening of the passenger door, in the warmth of the car offered to someone who did not belong to warmth anymore, and now, as the camera's display flickered to life once more without his consent, showing him not a crash or a coffin but a series of nearly identical scenes layered one over another, him driving, him braking, him pulling onto the shoulder, him turning his head just enough to see her standing there again, Evan understood that this was what the camera truly recorded, not death, but decision, the single moment where he chose the same thing over and over again, each iteration carving the groove deeper until there was no longer any room to choose differently. And as the voices beneath the tape hiss grew clearer, resolving into fragments of his own words spoken in different tones across different loops, concerned, irritated, exhausted, resigned, he felt the weight of repetition settle onto him like a physical burden, heavy and inescapable, his chest tightening as the clock advanced to 11:58 p.m. and the road ahead curved gently toward the familiar bend, not the deadly one that had haunted his fear, but the one that led inexorably back to mile 147, the place where the world always seemed to pause just long enough for him to make the same mistake again. His hands trembled on the wheel as the camera finally showed him something new, or perhaps something it had been waiting to show him all along, a view from outside the car, pulled back far enough to reveal faint impressions in the snow along the shoulder, sets of footprints overlapping and intersecting at impossible angles, dozens of them, hundreds, all converging on the same spot by the mile marker where a woman stood waiting with a camera in her hands, and among those impressions Evan recognized his own tire tracks, layered one atop another so many times that the snow beneath them had been ground down to ice, a scar in the landscape worn smooth by repetition, and with that image came understanding not as a sudden revelation but as a slow, crushing acceptance, that the crash was not the end of the loop, only its punctuation, that the real purpose of Midnight was not to kill him but to reset him, to return him to the moment before the promise could be broken, because the promise itself was what sustained her, what anchored her to the road and the storm and the camera, and as the dashboard clock flickered to 11:59 p.m. and the storm seemed to hold its breath, Evan felt the finality of it settle into his bones, the knowledge that he could brake, accelerate, scream, pray, but none of it would matter as long as the choice remained the same, and when the woman's voice finally emerged again from the camera, no longer layered with static or distortion but clear and intimate as if she were sitting beside him once more, it did not sound threatening or cruel, only patiently resigned as she said, "Just take me with you," and in that moment Evan understood that Midnight was not approaching from ahead on the clock but from behind him, closing the distance with every mile, every breath, every remembered kindness that had quietly become a curse, the numbers glowing on the dashboard poised on the brink of change as the road bent toward mile 147 once more and the camera's red light burned steadily, waiting for him to keep his resolution. Midnight arrived without ceremony, without fireworks, or cheers, or the imagined finality Evan had always associated with the turning of a year, because on that stretch of interstate the moment did not announce itself so much as settle, sliding quietly into place like the last piece of a puzzle that had been waiting patiently for him to notice it. The dashboard clock shifting from 11:59 p.m. to 12 a.m. with a soft digital blink that felt impossibly loud in the enclosed car, and for a fraction of a second, no longer than a held breath, everything stilled, the wind outside dropping to a low hush, the snow seeming to hang suspended in the air, the wipers pausing mid-swipe as if the world itself had hesitated to see what would happen next, and in that suspended moment Evan felt an unexpected calm wash over him, not relief, but recognition. The quiet acceptance that comes when a truth has been circling you for so long that resistance finally becomes more exhausting than surrender. The camera, still resting on the passenger seat, clicked softly, the tape reaching the end of its spool with a delicate, almost apologetic sound, and then, inevitably, it began to rewind, the hiss pulling backward through the car like a tide retreating from shore, and Evan closed his eyes as the sound filled the space behind his ribs, because he already knew what it would show him when it reached the beginning again, the same road, the same storm, the same mile marker rising out of the snow like a marker on a grave, and yet even with that knowledge something shifted inside him, a small but profound understanding that this time the loop was not tightening around him but opening just enough for a different truth to slip through. He opened his eyes and looked not at the road but at the passenger seat, and as if responding to his attention the woman appeared once more, not fading in or materializing with any theatrical flourish but simply being there, as she always had been, pale and quiet and impossibly still, the camera now resting idle in her lap, its red light dimmed to a faint, steady glow, and when she turned to look at him her expression was not expectant or hungry but weary, as though she too had been carrying the weight of repetition far longer than he had ever realized. "You made it," she said, her voice no longer emerging from the camera but from her own lips, and the sound of it was startlingly human, edged with something like relief, and Evan found that he was no longer afraid of her, not in the sharp, panicked way he had been before, because fear required the illusion of escape, and he understood now that escape had never been the point. "I always do," he replied quietly, and surprised himself by the steadiness of his voice, because this was no longer an argument or a denial, it was a statement of fact, and the woman nodded as if that was exactly the answer she had expected, her gaze drifting to the windshield where the storm had begun to move again, snow resuming its endless descent, the world lurching back into motion with a subtle, collective exhale. Devon eased his foot off the brake and let the car roll forward, not toward mile 147 this time but past it, watching the marker slip by in the corner of his vision without slowing, without stopping, the road beyond it opening up into a long, straight stretch that vanished into darkness, and he felt the absence of something then, a pressure lifting from his chest, the sense of being watched, receding like a headache finally easing, and when he glanced at the passenger seat again it was empty, the seat dry, no trace of snowmelt on the floor, no camera resting where it had been, just the faint impression of warmth lingering in the air as if someone had only just stood up. The dashboard clock read 12:01 a.m., then 12:02, the numbers advancing normally, obediently, and Evan laughed softly at the sound of it, a breathless, disbelieving laugh that fogged the windshield and then faded. Because the road ahead was clear now, the storm loosening its grip, the world widening again beyond the narrow tunnel of fear he had been trapped inside, and yet even as he drove on, relief settling into his muscles 1 mile at a time, he could not shake the awareness that something had not ended so much as moved on, that the kindness which had bound him to the loop had not been erased but redistributed, released back into the dark spaces where it would inevitably take root again. Hours later, when Evan finally reached home and shut off the engine, the silence of his driveway felt almost too complete, the night air mild compared to the frozen violence of the highway, and as he gathered his things and stepped out of the car he noticed something resting on the passenger seat, a small, rectangular object that had not been there a moment before, its surface scuffed and worn, a familiar weight settling into his hands as he picked it up, the camera, cold and inert now, no red light glowing, no hiss of tape inside, and when he flipped the display open it showed nothing at all, just a blank, dark screen. Reflecting his own tired face back at him, alive and breathing and framed by the quiet of a new year, Evan stood there for a long moment, the house lights warm behind him, the road stretching away into shadow ahead, and then he shut the camera off, set it gently on the seat, and walked inside without looking back, unaware that miles away, on a frozen stretch of interstate in the Midwest, a woman had begun to stand once more by a crooked mile marker, waiting patiently in the snow for a set of headlights that would arrive right on time, because midnight, after all, is not an ending, it is simply where the road learns how to repeat itself. Story 2, The Doppelganger in the Countdown. He arrived at the penthouse earlier than he meant to, which was unusual for him, because he had built an entire adult identity around the idea of arriving precisely when expected, never early enough to seem eager, never late enough to invite concern. But the night had felt slightly unmoored from the moment he stepped out of the taxi, London spread below him in a way that made the city look less like a place people lived and more like a decorative arrangement of light, something curated for observation rather than participation, and as the elevator carried him upward in near silence, its mirrored walls reflecting his face back at him from too many angles at once, he had the peculiar sensation that he was being prepared rather than transported, smoothed and repositioned by an invisible hand so that he would fit neatly into whatever waited at the top. When the doors opened, the sound reached him first, a low, continuous drum of music that seemed to pulse rather than play, its rhythm subtle enough to slip beneath conscious attention and settle directly into the body, followed by the gentle clink of glassware, the soft rise and fall of voices carefully modulated by wealth and expectation, and he stepped into the space with the strange awareness that this was not a room designed for comfort but for transition, a place people passed through on their way from one version of themselves to another, the walls all glass and steel, the furniture arranged more like suggestions than necessities, and beyond it all the windows stretching floor to ceiling, holding the city at arm's length as if it were something that might smudge if touched too directly. At the entrance, an attendant smiled with professional warmth and offered him a tray of masks, each one resting on black velvet like an artifact waiting to be claimed, and though he had been told this was a masquerade, an indulgent theme, a harmless affectation, he found himself hesitating longer than expected, fingers hovering over porcelain faces and lacquered beaks, feathers and gold filigree catching the light in ways that made it difficult to tell where one expression ended and another began. Until at last he selected a simple black mask, matte rather than glossy, its shape understated enough to feel almost invisible once worn, and as he tied the ribbon behind his head he experienced a faint but undeniable sense of relief, as though something essential had been set down gently, removed from his face and placed somewhere safe for the duration of the night. The room seemed to exhale in response. Or perhaps it was only him, but either way the music felt warmer now, the lights softer, the conversations easier to drift in and out of without consequence, and he accepted a glass of champagne he did not particularly want because it was easier than explaining why he did not want it, because explanations required anchoring, and already he felt less anchored than usual. Time behaved strangely in the penthouse, stretching and compressing without warning, moments slipping past unnoticed while others lingered with uncomfortable clarity, and he found himself moving through clusters of guests in a way that felt less like navigation and more like osmosis, absorbing fragments of conversation, travel plans, mutual acquaintances, the vague optimism people performed at the end of a year even when they did not quite believe it, yet none of it seemed to adhere to him, each interaction dissolving almost as soon as it occurred, leaving behind only the impression that he was expected to be there, that his presence completed some unspoken symmetry in the room. It was only when he drifted toward the balcony doors, drawn by the quiet pull of open space and the promise of air that had not been breathed already, that he noticed her, standing apart from the others in a way that did not feel lonely but deliberate, her posture relaxed yet contained, as if she were conserving energy for a purpose not yet revealed, and though she wore a mask like everyone else, hers was different enough to command attention without effort. A black rabbit, its surface absorbing light rather than reflecting it, the elongated ears curving upward in a way that framed her face without revealing it, giving the impression of parentheses around something that had not yet been said. She did not turn when he first approached, and for a moment he considered moving on, telling himself that the pull he felt was simply the novelty of the mask, the brain's habit of seeking patterns and symbols where none existed, but then she shifted slightly, angling her body just enough that the reflection in the glass caught both of them at once, two dark shapes against the luminous sprawl of the city, and when she spoke her voice seemed to arrive a fraction of a second before he registered the movement of her lips, low and even and unhurried, asking him whether he found it strange that the city looked so calm from up here, as if nothing truly ended down there, only changed shape, and he answered without thinking, surprised by the ease with which words formed in response, telling her that he sometimes felt the same way about people, that distance had a way of smoothing out the messiness until everything looked intentional, and she laughed softly at that, a sound that did not cut through the music so much as settle neatly into it, and from there the conversation unfolded with a fluidity that felt less like improvisation and more like recollection, topics rising and resolving themselves without effort, each of them anticipating the other's thoughts with an accuracy that should have been unsettling but instead felt reassuring. As though this were simply how conversation was meant to work when all the unnecessary parts were stripped away. As the night deepened, the penthouse grew warmer, bodies pressing closer together as anticipation replaced politeness, and yet within that tightening energy there was also a curious thinning, a sense that the room was becoming less solid, its edges less clearly defined, the glass walls no longer separating inside from outside so much as blurring the distinction between the two, and he became increasingly aware of the fact that he had stopped checking his phone, stopped thinking about the next day or the journey home, stopped orienting himself against anything beyond the immediate rhythm of the music and the woman beside him, who seemed to exist in a pocket of calm untouched by the mounting excitement, her attention focused entirely on him in a way that felt neither invasive nor performative, simply accurate, and when he remarked on it, on how easy it felt, how rare that was, she regarded him through the dark lenses of her mask and said that some people carried the same timing, that their lives moved on compatible frequencies, and that when such people met the world often mistook it for coincidence. The first digital clock appeared near the bar, glowing white against the dimness, its numbers large and unmistakable as they ticked steadily toward midnight, and with its appearance the room's energy shifted perceptibly, conversations acquiring an edge of urgency, laughter sharpening into something closer to insistence, as if everyone were aware on some level that whatever they failed to complete before the countdown would remain unfinished indefinitely, and he felt a subtle tightening in his chest, a sense of being gently but firmly ushered toward a moment he had not consciously agreed to attend, and when he glanced back at the woman in the rabbit mask she was already watching the clock, her head tilted slightly, her body still, as though she were listening for something beneath the music, something only she could hear. At 10 minutes to midnight, the host's voice rose above the crowd, distorted faintly by the sound system, reminding everyone to gather, to prepare, to be present for the turning of the year, and phones were raised like small, glowing talismans, their screens reflecting countless tiny versions of the same approaching moment, yet even as the crowd responded with enthusiasm he noticed a subtle irregularity in the sound, a faint lag between the host's words and the room's reaction, as though some people were hearing a slightly different version of events, and when the countdown began in earnest, 10, 9, 8, he felt a disquieting sense of dislocation, the numbers arriving at him out of sequence, overlapping and echoing in ways that made it impossible to tell which voice belonged to which moment, and through it all the woman remained steady, her presence anchoring him even as time itself seemed to wobble, and when he leaned closer to ask her whether she felt it too, the distortion, the sense that something was misaligned, she answered simply that midnight was not the same everywhere, that some places reached it earlier than others, and that occasionally those places overlapped in ways people did not notice until it was too late. As the count reached 3, 2, 1, the room erupted, sound and motion surging forward in a wave that carried him with it whether he wished to go or not, and in the chaos of celebration he felt the ribbon at the back of his mask loosen, fingers brushing against his hair as someone embraced him briefly before disappearing back into the crowd, and when the noise peaked and then began to break apart into individual moments again, he found himself standing alone near the balcony doors, mask in hand, the woman nowhere to be seen, and though logic insisted she had simply been absorbed into the mass of revelers, a deeper instinct told him she had not left so much as arrived somewhere else, and as he lifted his phone to check the time, 12:01 a.m., the numbers glowing with indifferent certainty, an unexpected tremor ran through him, the faint but unmistakable sense that while the year had turned, something else had quietly taken his place at the table, and that whatever had begun in this room was only just settling into its proper shape. After midnight, the penthouse did not empty so much as thin, as if the people who remained were only loosely tethered to the room, their laughter softer now, their movements slightly delayed, champagne flutes abandoned on ledges and low tables like offerings left behind for no one in particular, and he wandered through this loosened space with the uneasy sense that he had missed a cue everyone else had heard, his mask dangling from his fingers, the ribbon warm from his skin, and though the digital clocks insisted it was already the new year, the atmosphere suggested otherwise, a liminal stretch where celebration lingered out of habit rather than conviction. He told himself he was looking for the woman in the rabbit mask because he had enjoyed her company, because unfinished conversations had a way of nagging at him, but beneath that justification lay a deeper pull, the feeling that something essential remained unresolved, that she had not been a coincidence but a marker, and as he drifted toward the quieter edges of the penthouse, past the bar now cluttered with empty glasses, past clusters of guests engaged in intimate, half-shouted confessions, he became increasingly aware of the way his own reflection seemed to lag behind him in the glass walls, his movements echoed a fraction of a second too late, as if the room were struggling to keep pace with him. He found her near the far end of the balcony, standing just inside the open doors where the cold night air slipped in like a held breath finally released, the rabbit mask still in place, her posture unchanged from before midnight, and the sight of her produced a rush of relief so immediate it startled him, as though some internal tension he had not consciously acknowledged had been waiting for this exact confirmation to ease. She turned toward him before he spoke, as if his presence had been anticipated rather than noticed, and asked whether he had enjoyed the countdown, her tone neutral, almost curious, and he laughed softly at that, the sound brittle at the edges, telling her it had felt uneven, that the numbers had not quite lined up the way he expected, and she nodded as if this were not only unsurprising but inevitable, saying that people often assumed time was a single, shared experience, when in fact it behaved more like a series of overlapping broadcasts, each slightly out of sync, and he found himself leaning closer as she spoke, not because the music was loud but because her words carried a gravity that seemed to bend the surrounding noise around them. They talked then, not about the party or the new year or the polite abstractions that had filled the earlier part of the evening, but about smaller, stranger things, the sensation of déjà vu that lingered after certain conversations, the way some places felt familiar despite having never been visited, the discomfort of watching old videos of oneself and realizing that the person on the screen no longer quite matched the one doing the watching, and with each exchange he felt the unsettling recognition of being understood without explanation, of having his half-formed thoughts completed with unnerving precision, and when he commented on it, remarking that she seemed to know him unusually well for someone he had just met, she replied that "just met" was a relative term, that proximity did not always require shared history, only shared position, a word she lingered on as if it held multiple meanings layered one atop another. At some point, he could not later recall exactly when, she removed one glove, exposing a pale hand that looked almost luminous in the low light, and gestured toward the city beyond the glass, asking him where he considered home now, not in the geographic sense but in the way one thought of places that anchored memory, and the question caught him off guard, not because it was deeply personal but because it exposed a vagueness he had learned to ignore, and after a moment he answered honestly, saying that home had become more of a time than a place, a series of routines and relationships he maintained across distance, and she smiled at that, a small, almost approving curve of the lips beneath the rabbit mask, remarking that such arrangements were surprisingly fragile, that they depended on continuity more than people liked to admit, and that when continuity failed the resulting gaps had a way of filling themselves. As the night wore on, the penthouse seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm, the music lowering, the remaining guests drifting into slower conversations or retreating to couches and corners as if exhausted by the effort of maintaining celebration beyond its natural endpoint, and he became acutely aware of the fact that he and the woman had not been interrupted once, no one passing between them, no stray greeting or question breaking the thread of their exchange, and this isolation within the crowd began to feel intentional, as though the room itself were holding space for them, and when he finally glanced down at his phone, more out of habit than necessity, he was surprised to see a series of missed notifications, timestamps clustering tightly around midnight, messages from family and friends he had not yet read, and though nothing about them seemed urgent, the sight of them produced a flicker of unease, a sense that he was out of step with something important, and when he mentioned it to her, she regarded the phone thoughtfully before asking whether he planned to respond immediately or let the moment pass, and when he shrugged, saying it could wait, she nodded again, the gesture carrying a weight that made the choice feel more consequential than it should have been. It was then that he noticed the subtle inconsistencies, the details that did not quite align when he allowed himself to examine them directly, the fact that the woman never seemed to blink, not in the way people usually did, her gaze steady and unbroken even when the wind from the balcony stirred her hair, the way her reflection in the glass lagged just slightly behind her movements, echoing them with a delay that mirrored his own earlier observation, the faint sense that the air around her was cooler, not cold enough to be obvious, but distinct enough to register when he stood close, and though each of these anomalies could be explained away individually, fatigue, lighting, suggestion, their accumulation created a pressure that pressed inward, demanding recognition. "You look like you're trying to decide something," she said quietly, and he startled at the accuracy of it, admitting that he felt as though the night were asking something of him, though he could not quite articulate what, and she considered this for a long moment before replying that some moments existed precisely for that purpose, that they were thresholds rather than events. and that people often crossed them without realizing until much later, when the shape of their lives no longer matched their expectations. Her words settled heavily between them, and he found himself asking her directly then, something he had avoided until now, who she was, and though the question felt simple, almost banal, it landed with unexpected weight, the surrounding noise dimming as if the room itself were listening. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted a hand and touched the edge of his mask, fingers brushing lightly against the ribbon, and asked him whether he planned to keep it, and the question struck him as oddly intimate, prompting a flush of self-consciousness as he admitted he had already taken it off, holding it loosely at his side, and she nodded as if this confirmed something she had suspected, remarking that some people were quicker than others to shed disguises, while others required more time, more encouragement, and when he pressed again, repeating the question of her identity, she finally answered, her voice low and even, saying that names were less important than roles, and that tonight her role was simply to ensure alignment. The phrase lodged in his chest, cold and heavy. Alignment with what? He asked. She gestured gently toward the city, then toward the interior of the penthouse, and finally toward him, her hand hovering just short of his chest, and said that alignment was about placement, about ensuring that each version of a person occupied the space where it functioned best, that the world tended toward efficiency even when people resisted it, and that midnight was a particularly useful tool in that regard, because it allowed for clean divisions, before and after, old and new, here and elsewhere, and as she spoke he felt a creeping sense of vertigo, the floor beneath him seeming less stable, the lights overhead too bright, too sharp, and when he looked back at the glass he saw not one reflection but two, briefly overlapping before resolving again into a single image, and his breath caught painfully in his throat. "I don't understand," he said, though some part of him already did. She smiled then, not kindly, not cruelly, but with the calm assurance of someone who had seen this realization unfold many times before, and told him that understanding was rarely required at the moment of transition, that clarity often came later, when resistance had lost its urgency, and as she spoke she stepped back, increasing the distance between them just enough to make him aware of it, to make him aware of the space he occupied, and in that space he felt suddenly, acutely singular, as if something that had been mirroring him had shifted just out of reach, and when she turned toward the balcony and the city lights beyond, the rabbit mask catching the glow of 1,000 windows, he had the overwhelming sense that whatever choice he made next, whether to follow, to stay, to speak, or remain silent, would not end the conversation but simply determine which version of him would be present to continue it. The first sign that the countdown had not ended with midnight came not as sound but as sensation, a faint pressure behind his eyes as if the room were slowly tightening its focus, the penthouse's soft geometry sharpening into something more deliberate, more insistently present, and he became aware, without quite knowing why, that the music had slipped into a loop, the same progression of tones repeating with such subtlety that it took several cycles for the repetition to register, each return carrying with it a growing sense of unease, as though the night were trying to restart itself without asking permission. He glanced toward the digital clock near the bar, expecting to see the minutes advancing normally, but the numbers flickered uncertainly, briefly displaying 12:07 before dimming and reappearing as 11:58, the discrepancy so brief that he might have dismissed it as a trick of the light if not for the way his chest tightened in response, a visceral recognition that something was wrong, and when he turned back toward the balcony the woman in the rabbit mask was no longer there, her absence carving a noticeable hollow in the space she had occupied, the air cooler now, heavier, as if deprived of circulation. He told himself to leave. The thought surfaced fully formed, rational and sensible, a corrective measure against the growing disorientation, and he began to make his way toward the elevator with purposeful strides, only to find that the path felt longer than it should have, the room subtly rearranging itself so that the exit seemed to drift just out of reach, couches and standing guests creating gentle obstructions that required him to slow, to apologize, to adjust his course, and in that enforced delay his phone vibrated in his hand, the suddenness of it making him flinch, and when he looked down he saw his mother's name glowing on the screen, the timestamp reading 12 a.m. exactly, an impossibility that sent a cold ripple through him, because midnight had already passed, or had it, and without fully understanding why, he accepted the call, bringing the phone up to his ear as he continued walking, the sound of the party receding into a dull murmur behind him. His mother's voice broke through the noise in a rush, breathless and unsteady, calling his name with an urgency that immediately set his nerves on edge, and he tried to reassure her, telling her he was fine, that he was at a party, that nothing was wrong, but she cut him off before he could finish, insisting that he look, that he see, and before he could protest the call switched to video, the screen filling with the familiar warmth of his family's living room back home, the lighting softer. Then the penthouse's sterile glow, the furniture arranged in comforting, predictable patterns that tugged sharply at his sense of belonging. His mother's hand shook slightly as she held the phone, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and she turned slowly, deliberately, to include the rest of the room in the frame, and as the camera panned his breath caught painfully in his throat, because there he was, sitting at the dining table with his family, posture relaxed, shoulders easy, engaged in quiet conversation as if nothing in the world were amiss. It was not a distorted reflection or a poor imitation. It was him. The same hairline, the same habitual tilt of the head when listening, the same small, unconscious gestures that had never quite made it into photographs but were unmistakable in motion, and yet there was one crucial difference, one detail that rooted him to the spot even as the crowd flowed around him in the penthouse, unaware. The black rabbit mask rested lightly against his face, covering his features while somehow enhancing them, the elongated ears casting familiar shadows across his chest. And when the figure at the table looked up, when it looked directly into the camera, the smile it offered was not wide or threatening but perfectly calibrated, warm enough to reassure, controlled enough to suggest mastery, and the sight of it sent a wave of nausea rolling through him, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles ached. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. On the screen, his double reached out and placed a hand over his mother's, the gesture intimate, practiced, and she relaxed visibly at the contact, her shoulders easing as if soothed by a presence she trusted implicitly, and the ease of it, the way his family accepted the masked version of him without hesitation, hurt more than any overt threat could have, because it suggested not an intrusion but a replacement, something that fit so seamlessly into his life that no one thought to question it. The phone trembled in his hand as the call ended abruptly, the screen going dark and reflecting his own face back at him, pale and unmasked, eyes too bright, too exposed, and in that reflection he saw, for just an instant, the faint outline of the rabbit ears hovering behind his head, an afterimage that lingered even after he blinked hard enough to make his eyes sting. The penthouse felt hostile now, not in any obvious way, but in the subtle sense that it no longer acknowledged him as belonging, conversations flowing around him without intersecting, laughter sliding past his presence as if he were slightly out of phase with the room, and as he finally reached the elevator and pressed the button with shaking fingers, the digital display above it flickered uncertainly, cycling through numbers too quickly to read before settling on a symbol that did not correspond to any floor, and in that moment the woman's voice surfaced again in his memory, calm and assured, speaking of alignment and placement, and he understood with sickening clarity that the countdown had not been a singular event but a mechanism, one that could be triggered more than once, recalibrating reality until each piece fell into what it considered the most efficient configuration. The elevator doors slid open, revealing an interior that looked identical to the one that had brought him up earlier, and yet stepping inside felt wrong, the space too small, the air too still, and as the doors closed behind him he caught one last glimpse of the penthouse reflected in the mirrored walls, the guests continuing their muted celebration, oblivious to the fact that midnight was happening again somewhere else. And the descent began without him selecting a floor, the numbers on the panel counting down on their own, 10, 9, 8, not floors but seconds, their glow harsh and insistent, and as the elevator sank lower and lower he realized that whatever had taken his place at the table back home was not becoming him but remembering how to be him, guided by a rhythm he had stepped out of the moment he chose to stay at the party, and by the time the display reached zero and the doors opened onto an empty lobby, he knew with a certainty that settled coldly in his bones that the countdown was not finished with him yet, that it would continue to replay until only one version of him remained in the places that mattered, and that the longer he lingered in this misaligned space, the more permanent that decision would become. The lobby was empty in the way only liminal spaces ever were, not abandoned exactly but waiting, the polished stone floor reflecting the ceiling lights with an almost liquid sheen, and as he stepped out of the elevator the doors slid shut behind him with a sound that felt final rather than procedural, the soft thump echoing a little too long in the open space, and for a moment he simply stood there, phone still clutched in his hand, chest tight with the effort of breathing evenly, trying to orient himself against something solid, something that would confirm he was still anchored in the same sequence of moments he had entered the building with. The security desk was unmanned, a half-finished mug of tea cooling beside a monitor that displayed nothing but a looping feed of empty corridors, and when he glanced at it he noticed with a fresh wave of unease that the timestamp in the corner read 12 hours, frozen in place as if time itself had paused out of courtesy, and the sight of those unmoving numbers stirred a realization he had been avoiding, that midnight, whatever it was here, did not progress forward so much as hold, waiting for resolution before allowing anything beyond it to exist. Outside, the city greeted him with noise and motion that should have been comforting, traffic flowing along the streets, distant sirens weaving through the hum of engines, voices spilling out of doorways as revelers stumbled into the early hours of the new year, yet even as he stepped onto the pavement and felt the cold night air brush against his exposed face, he sensed a faint resistance, as if the world were pushing back gently against his presence, the way water resisted a hand moving through it, and as he began to walk, his reflection in the darkened shop windows seemed to trail him by a fraction of a second, never quite aligning with his movements, an effect subtle enough that he might have dismissed it as fatigue if not for the way it tightened his chest with every step. He tried calling home. The line rang once, twice, then connected, and for a moment he allowed himself to hope that the earlier call had been a misunderstanding, some elaborate coincidence made monstrous by the strangeness of the night. But when his mother answered, her voice was calm, almost cheerful, asking whether he had made it back safely from the party, and the casual normalcy of her tone struck him harder than panic would have, because it suggested not concern but continuity, a life proceeding smoothly without him. He asked her what she meant, asked her who she thought she was speaking to, and there was a brief pause on the line, a silence filled with the faint sound of movement in the background, cutlery being set down, a chair scraping softly against the floor, and then she laughed gently and told him not to be silly, that he was right there with them, that he had just stepped out to take a call, and before he could protest she handed the phone to someone else, and the voice that answered was his own. "Hey," it said, warm and familiar, carrying the exact cadence he had developed over years of phone calls and small talk. "I think the connection's bad. Are you outside?" The world tilted. He pressed the phone harder against his ear, fingers numb, listening as the other version of him continued speaking, apologizing for the confusion, explaining that the party had been loud, that time zones always made these calls strange, and with each word the horror deepened, because there was no malice in the voice, no mockery or distortion, only concern, patience, and an uncanny fluency in the details of a life he knew intimately. When he finally found his own voice again, it came out thin and strained as he asked what day it was, and the answer, delivered without hesitation, matched his own calendar, his own understanding of the date, and yet he felt the gap widening between them, a subtle but decisive divergence that could not be bridged by shared facts alone. He hung up without explanation. The phone screen went dark, reflecting his face back at him, and this time the reflection did not fade when he shifted his gaze, remaining fixed in place for an extra beat before finally catching up, and the sight of it sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He began to walk again, faster now, driven by a need to reach somewhere familiar, somewhere that might still recognize him as belonging, and he found himself heading not toward his hotel but toward a small cafe he frequented when in the city, a place where the barista knew his order and the walls were cluttered with mismatched art, a place that had always felt comfortably anchored in routine. The cafe lights were on. Inside, a few patrons lingered over late drinks, their laughter subdued, the atmosphere warm and unhurried, and when he pushed the door open a bell chimed softly, the sound sending a sharp spike of relief through him because it was exactly as he remembered, unaltered, and he stepped inside with a tentative smile, nodding toward the counter where the barista was wiping down the espresso machine, preparing to close. She looked up, met his eyes, and frowned. "I'm sorry," she said politely, confusion edging her voice, "we're actually about to shut down." He nodded quickly, assuring her that was fine, that he just needed a moment, and as he moved further into the room he noticed the way her gaze lingered on him, not with recognition but with the careful assessment reserved for strangers, and when he mentioned his usual order out of habit, she smiled apologetically and said she didn't think they'd met before, and the words landed like a quiet verdict, confirming what the night had been steadily building toward, that the more he moved through the world, the less it knew what to do with him. Back outside, the realization settled fully, heavy and inescapable, that the other version of him was not merely occupying his life but maintaining it, reinforcing all the small connections and routines that defined belonging, while he drifted further out of sync with each step he took, and the woman's words about alignment returned to him with chilling clarity. Her calm assurance that some versions functioned better in certain spaces, that efficiency demanded consolidation rather than duplication, and as he walked he began to notice subtle confirmations of this principle everywhere, small things that might have gone unnoticed on any other night, a passerby glancing through him as if he were not quite there, a streetlight flickering briefly when he passed beneath it, the faint echo of his footsteps sounding slightly delayed, as though recorded and played back at the wrong speed. By the time he reached the bridge overlooking the river, dawn threatening faintly at the edges of the sky, exhaustion had hollowed him out, leaving behind a strange clarity, and he stopped there, leaning against the railing, watching the dark water move beneath him with a steady indifference that felt almost reassuring, because the river did not care which version of him stood above it, it flowed regardless. And in that moment he understood that the choice he thought he had lost might still exist, but not in the way he had imagined. He could continue moving, continue insisting on his presence in a world that was increasingly resistant, or he could accept the logic of the alignment, allow the other version of him to remain where it fit most seamlessly, and in doing so release himself from the constant friction of misplacement. The thought frightened him, not because it suggested death or erasure, but because it offered relief. His phone vibrated again, and this time he answered without hesitation, the screen filling with the familiar image of his family's living room, now quieter, the celebration winding down, and there he was again at the table, mask gone now, his face fully visible, relaxed in a way that made something in the viewer's chest ache, and when that version of him looked into the camera, there was no smile, only a calm, attentive gaze that seemed to regard him not as an enemy or a curiosity but as a necessary remainder, and when it spoke, its words were gentle, almost compassionate, telling him that it was all right, that everything was being taken care of, that he didn't need to struggle anymore, and as he listened he realized that this was the final function of the countdown, not to announce a beginning or an end, but to determine which self would continue to be counted. And as the call ended and the screen went dark once more, he felt the last threads of resistance loosen, the city around him settling into a muted calm as if acknowledging a decision already made somewhere deeper than thought. Morning arrived without asking him whether he was ready for it, the sky over London lightening from black to a diluted gray that felt less like dawn and more like the thinning of a dream, and he realized with a distant, hollow surprise that he had not slept at all, that the night had simply carried him forward without pause, depositing him on the edge of a day that no longer quite acknowledged his presence. Because as he moved through the streets in those early hours, past shuttered storefronts and littered sidewalks still bearing the quiet debris of celebration, he felt increasingly insubstantial, as though his body were learning a new, lesser weight, his footsteps producing sound without conviction, his breath fogging the air but leaving no warmth behind. He stopped once, catching sight of himself in the dark glass of a bus shelter, and was unsettled to find that his reflection did not meet his eyes immediately, lingering instead in a neutral expression for a heartbeat too long before mirroring his movement, and in that delay he recognized the same lag he had noticed earlier in the penthouse, the same misalignment that now seemed to define him entirely, a version of himself always a fraction of a second behind the world, never quite arriving where he intended to be. By mid-morning, the city had fully resumed its routine, commuters filling the streets with purpose and impatience, and though he walked among them without obstruction, he sensed the subtle ways they avoided him, gazes sliding past rather than landing, bodies adjusting their trajectories just enough to prevent collision, and when he entered a small convenience shop to buy coffee more out of habit than desire, the cashier greeted him with practiced neutrality, her eyes flicking briefly to his face and then away again without the faint spark of recognition that usually accompanied human exchange, and as he stood there waiting for his change he felt an unexpected pang of grief, not for the life he had lost, but for the ordinary friction of existence, the small acknowledgments, the shared rhythms, that had quietly confirmed his place in the world. He tried, once more, to call home. The line connected immediately, and the sound of his family's house filled his ear, the familiar background noises of a morning settling into itself, and when his mother answered she sounded content, grounded, asking whether he wanted her to save some breakfast for later, and the question struck him as both tender and devastating, because it confirmed what he already knew. That the version of him sitting at that table had become the default, the one the world recognized and responded to without hesitation. He asked her then, carefully, whether she felt as though anything had changed since the night before, whether anything felt different, and she paused just long enough to suggest thought before replying that no, everything felt exactly as it should, that the new year had begun quietly, comfortably, and that he seemed more at ease than he had in a long time, and in the background he heard his own voice laugh softly at that, a sound so natural and unforced that it loosened something tight and aching in his chest. He ended the call gently, thanking her, telling her he would call again later, and when the line went dead he stood for a long moment with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to nothing, because the silence felt like the most honest response the world had offered him all night, and in that silence he finally understood the full shape of what had occurred. The masquerade had not been about concealment but selection. The countdown not a celebration but a sorting mechanism, a way for time to decide which version of a person would continue to propagate through the network of relationships that defined a life, and which would be released into a quieter, thinner existence where expectations no longer applied. The woman in the rabbit mask had not been an antagonist or a predator but a facilitator, a figure who ensured that the transition occurred smoothly, without the kind of rupture that drew attention. And with that understanding came a surprising sense of calm, because while the process had been terrifying in its execution, its intention was not cruel, merely indifferent, the way systems often were. As the day wore on, he found that the resistance he had felt earlier began to ease, the world no longer pushing back so sharply against his presence, and though this did not restore his former solidity, it did grant him a strange freedom, the ability to move without being tracked, to exist without being counted, and he tested this cautiously at first, lingering in places he had once hurried through, watching conversations unfold without feeling compelled to participate, noticing details that had previously been lost to obligation, and with each passing hour he sensed himself settling into this new role, not as an intruder or a ghost but as something adjacent, a remainder that no longer needed to justify itself. That evening, as the city lights flickered on once more and the new year established its rhythm, he returned to the river, drawn by the same quiet pull that had brought him there before, and as he leaned against the railing he watched the reflections ripple and distort beneath him, countless versions of the city shimmering and dissolving with each passing wave, and he thought of the other version of himself sitting down to dinner with family, answering messages, planning a future that now felt oddly distant, and instead of resentment he felt a muted gratitude, because that life was being lived well, competently, without the hesitation and displacement that had marked his own experience for longer than he cared to admit. His phone vibrated one last time. The screen lit up, not with a call or a message, but with a simple notification, a countdown timer set to 0, its digits frozen in place, and though there was no sender attached, he understood it instinctively as a confirmation rather than a warning, an acknowledgement that the process was complete, and as he dismissed it with a slow swipe of his thumb, the faint pressure he had felt behind his eyes since the penthouse finally eased, leaving behind a clarity that felt earned rather than imposed. He stayed by the river until night fully claimed the sky, the city settling into its nocturnal patterns, and as he turned to leave he caught a glimpse of movement in the glass of a nearby building, a familiar silhouette marked by elongated shadows, and for a moment he thought he saw the rabbit mask again, ears framing an attentive gaze, but when he looked directly there was nothing there, only his own reflection, steady now, aligned at last with his movements, and he realized then that the true horror of the night had not been the loss of his life, but the recognition that lives could be optimized without consent, sorted according to a logic that valued continuity over individuality, and as he walked away, unremarkable and uncounted, he understood that somewhere, at the exact moment the world welcomed a new year, time had made a decision on his behalf, and that if he listened carefully, in the quiet moments just before sleep, he could still hear the echo of the countdown, not ticking forward anymore, but receding, reminding him that some versions of us exist only so the rest can move on. Story 3, The Ice Beneath the Cabin. The lake did not look frozen in the way lakes usually did in winter, not fractured or opaque or dusted unevenly with snow, but sealed, as though someone had taken a single, uninterrupted sheet of glass and laid it carefully over the water, smoothing out every imperfection until the surface reflected the sky with unnerving clarity, and when the truck came to a stop beside the cabin and the engine ticked softly as it cooled, he found himself staring at that reflection longer than necessary. Unsettled by the way the stars appeared both above and below him, identical constellations suspended in two directions at once, as if the world had been folded inward on itself without leaving a crease. The cabin sat close to the shoreline, closer than he would have expected, its log walls dark against the snow, its porch cleared so neatly it looked recently swept despite the heavy snowfall earlier that afternoon, and he noticed this only in passing as they unloaded their gear, the observation registering as a faint irregularity rather than a warning, because irregularities were easy to dismiss when framed as conveniences, and he had come here precisely to stop noticing things, to mark the end of the year with something simple and physical and honest, something that did not require reflection or decision. "Feels empty," his friend said casually, slinging a pack over his shoulder as they walked toward the door. He nodded, though he wasn't sure what the word meant in this context. The place did not feel abandoned. It felt cleared. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and cold iron, the air holding onto a chill that lingered even after the fireplace crackled to life, flames licking eagerly at the logs as if grateful for the interruption, and as the warmth began to spread in slow, uneven waves, he became aware of how quiet the space truly was, not the comfortable quiet of isolation but a deeper stillness, the kind that pressed against the ears and made small sounds, boots scuffing wood, fabric rustling, breath escaping. Feel too loud, too present. They had done this before, ice fishing at the turn of the year, but never here, never this far north, and as they unpacked supplies and set mugs on the rough wooden table, his friend joked about how far off the grid they were now, about how no one would hear them if something went wrong, and though the comment was meant lightly, it landed with an unexpected weight, settling into the space between them and refusing to lift, and when he laughed in response it sounded brittle, as though the sound itself were unsure whether it belonged. Outside, night arrived quickly, the sky darkening to a flat, starless black that made the ice glow faintly in the lantern light, and when they stepped back out to drill the fishing hole, the cold wrapped around him with an intensity that felt precise rather than aggressive, a cold that did not bite so much as measure, seeping through layers until it reached the bone and stopped there, content, the auger bit into the ice with a low, grinding growl, vibrations traveling up through his arms and into his shoulders, and with each rotation he felt a growing resistance, not from the thickness of the ice, which was substantial but expected, but from something else, a subtle pressure that made the work feel slower than it should have been, as though the lake were reluctant to open itself. When the final layer gave way, there was no splash. Water welled up into the hole silently, dark and smooth, absorbing the lantern light without reflection, and for a brief, inexplicable moment he felt the urge to step back, to put distance between himself and that opening, because the darkness beneath did not behave like depth, it behaved like space, unbounded and attentive, and when his friend leaned over to peer into it, joking again about how deep it must be, the words failed to register fully, drowned out by the sound of his own heartbeat. Suddenly loud in his ears, they set their lines and waited. Time stretched. The minutes passed not in a sequence but in a kind of suspension, the cold keeping their bodies alert even as the mind drifted, and as they stood there with mugs warming their hands, the silence around the lake deepened further, becoming so complete that it felt artificial, as though sound itself had been turned down deliberately, and it was in that silence that he first became aware of the sensation beneath his boots, a faint vibration that traveled upward through the ice, too regular to be natural, too soft to be accidental. Tap. He froze. His friend looked at him, eyebrows raised. "Did you feel that?" Before he could answer, it came again. Tap. Tap. Not random. Not shifting. Deliberate. The ice held. He straightened slowly, every instinct urging caution, his breath fogging in short, shallow bursts, and when his friend laughed nervously and suggested it was just the lake settling, the explanation rang hollow even as it was spoken, because the rhythm had not changed, had not dispersed or deepened, but remained fixed, patient, and though the sound did not repeat immediately, its absence felt heavier than its presence, leaving behind a pressure in the air that made the lantern light seem dimmer. The stars above sharper, as if the world were holding its breath in anticipation of something else. They did not leave. Instead, they waited longer, convincing themselves that the moment had passed, that the mind filled gaps with patterns when given enough darkness and quiet, and for a time the lake remained still, the surface unbroken, the whole dark and unresponsive, until the sky began to change near the horizon, a faint green glow bleeding upward like a bruise beneath the stars, the aurora unfolding in slow, silent curtains that rippled and shifted without sound, beautiful in a way that felt deeply wrong. Given the tension coiled beneath his ribs, and as the light intensified, washing the ice in pale color, he felt a sudden heaviness settle into his limbs, movement requiring effort, breath coming harder, and he realized with dawning unease that the lake was not responding to the sky above it but to the time, to the moment creeping closer with each unseen tick of the clock. When the knocking returned, it came not from one place but many. Tap. 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 Closer now. Surrounding. And when he finally raised the flashlight and aimed it down into the hole, he was no longer surprised to see that the darkness beneath the ice was looking back. The beam of the flashlight did not behave the way he expected it to, because instead of scattering through the water in a familiar cone, breaking apart into drifting motes and darkness, it seemed to slow, thickening as it traveled downward, as though the lake itself were resisting illumination, and for a second, no longer than a held breath, he saw nothing at all, only blackness swallowing the light hole, and then the first face emerged, pale and distorted, features stretched by water and ice. Yet unmistakably human, eyes wide and reflective, fixed not on the light but on him, and the shock of it stole the air from his lungs so completely that he forgot to breathe, his body locking in place as more shapes drifted into view, resolving slowly, reluctantly, as if they were deciding whether to be seen. There were dozens of them. Men, women, children, ages difficult to determine through the warped glass of ice and water, but all pressed upward, faces flattened against the underside of the frozen surface, mouths opening and closing in a silent, synchronized rhythm that suggested speech without sound, plea without language, and though his mind scrambled for rational explanations, refraction, hallucination, exhaustion, the consistency of the movement destroyed any hope of dismissal, because they were not drifting aimlessly or appearing at random. They were gathering, clustering around a fishing hole with deliberate focus, and as the flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam catching on one face and then another, he noticed that their eyes tracked the light with unsettling precision, pupils adjusting, expressions shifting subtly as if reacting to his presence. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the ice, the cold seeping through his gloves as the flashlight slipped from his grip and clattered onto the frozen surface, spinning briefly before coming to rest near the hole, its beam now angled sideways, illuminating the water at a slant, and in that skewed light the faces seemed to stretch, their features elongating in grotesque ways that made his stomach churn, and he scrambled backward, breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps, heart pounding so violently it felt as though it might crack his ribs from the inside. When he looked up, his friend was staring at him with wide eyes, demanding to know what he had seen, his voice pitched too high, too fast, but the words tangled uselessly in his throat, language failing in the face of something that did not belong to any vocabulary he possessed. He swallowed hard. There are people under there. The sentence sounded absurd even as he spoke it, stripped of the terror that accompanied the sight, and his friend let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head as if to dislodge the idea, insisting that there was no way, that the lake was too deep, that the ice was too thick, that no one could survive beneath it long enough to gather like that, and yet even as he spoke, the knocking resumed, louder now, closer, vibrations rippling up through the ice in a pattern that felt disturbingly like response, and the laughter died abruptly, replaced by a brittle silence as his friend crouched cautiously and peered into the hole. He saw nothing at first. Then his posture stiffened. The color drained from his face. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned back, putting distance between himself and the opening, and when he looked up again his eyes held the same hollow shock he felt twisting inside his own chest, confirmation settling between them without the need for further explanation, and in that moment he understood that whatever lay beneath the ice was not a solitary anomaly, not a single trapped figure or a trick of light, but a presence, communal and aware, something that existed in numbers large enough to feel organized, purposeful, and the realization made his skin prickle with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. They should have left then. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat to the cabin, to lock the door, to put distance and solid ground between themselves and the lake, but fear did not produce action so much as paralysis, a narrowing of options that made even obvious choices feel unreachable, and as they stood there, the aurora overhead intensified, the green light brightening, spreading across the sky in rippling waves that cast shifting shadows across the ice. And with each pulse of color the faces beneath the surface seemed to move, drifting closer, aligning themselves directly beneath the hole as if drawn by the light, by the attention, by the simple fact of being noticed. A sound rose from the water. Not knocking this time, but something lower, softer, a vibration that traveled upward through the ice and into his bones, resonating in his chest like a distant engine, and as it grew louder he realized it was not a single sound but many layered together, overlapping hums that merged into something almost melodic, a wordless chorus that suggested breath moving through water-filled lungs, impossible and relentless. And his friend clapped his hands over his ears, shouting something he could not hear over the sound. Panic etched into every line of his body. The ice cracked. A sharp, gunshot sound split the night, a fissure racing outward from the hole in a jagged line that glowed briefly with reflected aurora light, and both of them stumbled back instinctively, boots slipping as the surface shifted beneath them, and for a horrifying moment he thought the lake would open completely, that the ice would give way and release whatever lay beneath in a violent, unstoppable surge, but instead the crack stopped, freezing in place as if halted by an unseen boundary, the lake holding itself together with deliberate restraint. Then the faces vanished. The water beneath the hole went dark again, swallowing the light, the chorus fading into silence so complete it left his ears ringing, and the sudden absence felt worse than the presence had, like the withdrawal of pressure that left something raw and exposed in its wake. His friend staggered, nearly falling, and he reached out automatically, grabbing his arm and pulling him upright, and for a moment they clung to each other like survivors of a near collision, breath ragged, eyes darting to the hole as if expecting the nightmare to resume at any second. "It's done," his friend said hoarsely. "Whatever it was. It's over." The word sounded like a plea rather than a conclusion. They packed up without discussion, movements jerky and inefficient, hands trembling too much to manage the simple tasks they had performed countless times before, and as they retreated toward the cabin the lake remained still, unbroken, the hole already beginning to glaze over with a thin layer of ice as if eager to erase the evidence of its own interruption. Inside, they bolted the door and stoked the fire until the flames roared high, heat pressing back against the cold and waves that made his skin sting, and for a while they said nothing, sitting opposite each other at the table, mugs untouched, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the room. Gradually, sensation returned. The pounding in his chest eased, breath slowing, the world shrinking back down to the manageable dimensions of the cabin, and with that return came doubt, insidious and persistent, whispering that fear had distorted perception, that darkness and exhaustion had combined to create a shared hallucination, and when his friend finally laughed, a short, shaky sound, and suggested exactly that, relief surged through him despite the lingering dread, because rationalization offered a lifeline, a way to frame the night as an aberration rather than a revelation. They agreed to sleep. It was nearly midnight, the new year approaching whether they acknowledged it or not, and exhaustion pressed heavily against his eyelids as he stretched out on the narrow bed, the fire reduced to a steady glow, shadows dancing across the log walls in familiar, comforting patterns, and as he lay there listening to the wind move softly around the cabin, he felt the tension drain from his body in stages, fear giving way to fatigue, consciousness slipping unevenly, and it was in that liminal state, not fully awake and not yet asleep, that he became aware of a new sound. Breathing. Not his own. It was faint, rhythmic, coming from somewhere beneath him, too slow to be animal, too steady to be imagined, and as his eyes snapped open he realized the sound was not in the room but below it, traveling up through the floorboards with unsettling clarity, and the memory of the faces surged back with renewed force, his pulse spiking as he lay there listening, counting the breaths unconsciously, and when the sound was joined by a soft, deliberate tapping from beneath the cabin, the same measured rhythm they had heard on the ice, he understood with a sickening certainty that whatever lived beneath the lake did not confine itself to the water alone. It had followed them back. The tapping did not grow louder, which was somehow worse than if it had, because it suggested intention rather than escalation, a measured patience that allowed him to count the spaces between each sound without ever predicting the next, and he lay there rigid on the narrow bed, eyes open, breath shallow, listening as the rhythm traveled up through the floorboards and into the frame of the cabin itself, the wood responding with faint creaks and pops as if acknowledging the contact, and when he turned his head slightly he saw that his friend was awake too, lying on the opposite bed with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched beneath the skin, neither of them speaking because speech felt like an invitation, like permission for the sound to move closer, to become something else. For a long time, minutes or hours, he could not tell, the tapping continued unchanged, neither accelerating nor stopping, and the fire burned down to embers that glowed dully in the hearth, the cabin cooling in uneven pockets that made the air feel heavier near the floor, and it was in that creeping cold that he first noticed the smell, faint at first, then unmistakable once recognized, the clean, mineral scent of deep water mixed with something older, organic, a smell he associated dimly with basements that flooded and were never properly dried, and as he drew in a careful breath he realized the scent was strongest near the floor, rising slowly as if exhaled from below, and panic threatened to surface fully then, hot and disorienting, but he forced it down, reminding himself that fear could fracture thought, that whatever this was required attention rather than reaction. The tapping stopped. The sudden absence left a ringing silence that pressed against his ears, and he held his breath unconsciously, waiting for the sound to resume, but instead there came a new sensation, a subtle vibration that traveled through the floor in a broad, diffuse way, not localized like the tapping had been, but spread evenly across the cabin's base, and the effect of it was strangely soothing, a low-frequency hum that resonated in his chest and made his thoughts feel slower, heavier, and before he could stop himself he felt his eyelids begin to droop, exhaustion asserting itself with renewed force, and it took conscious effort to stay awake, to keep his mind anchored in the present rather than drifting into whatever rhythm the vibration suggested. "Do you feel that?" his friend whispered. The sound of his voice was startling in the quiet, the words seeming too loud even at that low volume, and the vibration faltered briefly, as if reacting to the interruption, before settling back into its previous pattern, and he nodded in response even though his friend could not see him clearly, the motion small and stiff. "It wants us to sleep," his friend continued, the words emerging slowly, as if pulled from him rather than offered freely. I think that's how it works." The realization sent a chill through him sharper than the cold, because it aligned too easily with what they had already seen, with the faces beneath the ice and the way they had moved in unison, synchronized, as though governed by a shared rhythm, and he wondered then how many of them had fallen asleep willingly, lulled into stillness by that same hum, how many had mistaken it for safety, for rest, for the end of vigilance. The vibration faded. In its place came a sound so soft it took him a moment to register it as anything other than imagination, a voice, muffled and distorted, rising up through layers of wood and earth, syllables stretched and blurred until meaning dissolved, yet carrying an unmistakable cadence, the rise and fall of speech, and as the sound strengthened, words began to emerge, fragmented but recognizable, and his blood ran cold when he realized what they were hearing. Names, not random ones, but familiar ones, spoken slowly, deliberately, each name followed by a pause as if waiting for acknowledgement, and when his own name surfaced among them, pronounced with unsettling accuracy despite the distortion, a jolt of fear shot through him so intense it momentarily overrode the numbing cold, and he sat up abruptly, feet hitting the floor with a dull thud that seemed to reverberate downward. "Don't answer," he said sharply, his voice cracking despite his effort to control it. "Whatever you hear, don't." The floor beneath them shifted. Not enough to be dramatic, not enough to suggest collapse, but enough to confirm that the sound had been noticed, that the space below the cabin was responsive, and his friend let out a strangled sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, clutching the edge of the bed as if steadying himself. "It knows us," his friend said, eyes wide now, reflecting the dim light from the embers. "It knows us already." The voice from below grew clearer, more insistent, the distortion easing just enough for him to recognize tone beneath the words, and what chilled him most was that the tone was not threatening or angry, but gentle, coaxing, as though the thing speaking believed itself to be offering something desirable, something long overdue, and when it spoke again it did not use names but phrases. Fragments of memory that slid easily into his mind despite his resistance, references to moments he had never spoken aloud, regrets he had buried so deeply he rarely acknowledged them even to himself, and as the voice continued he felt his thoughts begin to drift, attention narrowing until the cabin, the cold, the danger all seemed distant, replaced by a vivid recollection of standing on the lake years ago in summer, the water clear and inviting, the sun warm on his shoulders. His friend gasped. He looked up in time to see him rise from the bed, movements slow and oddly fluid, eyes unfocused as if tracking something only he could see, and panic surged through him with renewed force as he scrambled to his feet, grabbing his friend's arm and pulling him back with more strength than he thought he possessed, the contact grounding him momentarily as his friend cried out in protest, voice slurred, insisting that it was all right, that they were being called, that there was no reason to be afraid. "Listen to me," he said urgently, gripping his friend's shoulders and forcing eye contact. "That thing doesn't want us awake. That's not an accident." His friend's gaze flickered, confusion briefly cutting through the haze, and for a moment he thought he had reached him, that the words had broken whatever hold the voice from below had begun to exert, but then the floor shuddered again, stronger this time, and the voice spoke with sudden clarity, shedding its distortion as if pleased by the exchange. "It is cold where you are," it said, the words rising through the cabin with unnatural precision. "You are tired. We can hold you." The phrasing was wrong in a way that made his skin crawl, the pronouns collective, impersonal, and as the voice continued he realized it was not addressing them individually but together, speaking to the bond between them, to the shared fatigue and trust that had brought them here in the first place, and his friend's resistance crumbled under that pressure, his posture slackening as he turned back toward the door, eyes glassy with longing. The knocking resumed, louder now, no longer patient but urgent, coming from multiple points beneath the cabin, and the boards creaked ominously in response, dust shaking loose from unseen seams, and as the sound intensified he understood with terrible clarity that the cabin was not a refuge but a threshold, a structure placed deliberately close to the lake, positioned where the barrier between above and below was thinnest, and that whatever lived beneath the ice had been reaching up through it. For far longer than they had been aware, he dragged his friend back toward the bed, shoving him down with a force born of desperation, and for a moment the voice faltered, the knocking breaking rhythm as if confused by the resistance, and in that brief gap he grabbed the lantern and flung it toward the door, shattering the glass and plunging the room into near darkness, because some instinct told him light was part of the invitation, that the glow guided whatever waited below, and in the sudden dimness the cabin felt smaller, more defensible, the shadows thick and close. The voice rose in anger then, the gentle cadence hardening into something sharper, and the knocking escalated into impacts that rattled the walls, the floor vibrating violently beneath them as if struck from below by something far larger than hands, and he realized with a jolt of terror that the ice they had drilled into earlier was not the only opening, that the lake had been reaching up through the earth itself, through roots and rot, following paths laid down over years of erosion and neglect, and as the cabin shuddered and his friend screamed, clutching at his arm, he knew that this was the moment the night would demand payment. The floor split with a sound like tearing fabric. A narrow fissure opened between the boards, dark and wet, and from within it came a rush of icy air that smelled of deep water and decay, and he felt hands brush his ankle, cold and slick, fingers wrapping briefly around his boot before slipping away, and in that contact he felt not hunger but recognition, a familiarity that suggested the thing below did not see them as prey but as missing pieces, and as he stumbled backward, dragging his friend with him, the cabin groaned around them, its foundations protesting the strain of something pushing upward with relentless force. The aurora flared outside, its green light bleeding in through the windows and cracks in the walls, bathing the room in an unearthly glow that made everything seem unreal, suspended, and in that light he saw shapes moving beneath the floor, shadows shifting just beyond the wood, bodies pressing upward, and the voice spoke one final time, its words resonating in his skull rather than his ears. "It is almost time. Midnight." The realization hit him with the force of a blow, and as the clock somewhere in the cabin ticked closer to the hour, he understood that the lake's power was bound not only to place but to time, that the turning of the year weakened whatever barrier held it back, and that once the moment passed, there would be no closing the door again, no retreat from what had been invited. He did not know then which of them would be taken, only that the choice was no longer entirely his, and as the floor continued to give way beneath their feet and the voice from below called them closer with increasing urgency, he realized that survival would not be decided by strength or speed, but by something far more terrible, who the lake decided could be replaced. The cabin did not collapse all at once, which would have been merciful in its own blunt way, but instead surrendered itself inch by inch, wood fibers screaming softly as the floor bowed under pressure from below, the fissure widening just enough for icy air to pour upward in visible currents that carried the smell of the lake with them, and in that freezing breath he felt time stretch thin, every second elongated into a fragile filament he was terrified to snap, because beneath the chaos there was an unmistakable deliberateness to the destruction, a sense that whatever pushed from below was not raging blindly but measuring, testing the limits of the structure and the people trapped inside it with patient precision. The aurora outside surged brighter, green light flooding the room through the windows and the widening cracks in the walls, and in that unnatural glow he saw the floorboards lift and settle rhythmically, as if the cabin itself were breathing in shallow, labored gasps, and with each rise and fall the voice from below grew clearer, its cadence smoothing out as if pleased with the progress it was making. "It is cold where you are," it repeated, not louder but closer now, the words vibrating directly through his bones. "You do not belong in the air." His friend cried out again, this time not in panic but in confusion, his resistance fraying under the relentless pressure of exhaustion and suggestion, and as the floor shifted violently beneath them he lost his footing, stumbling toward the widening crack, arms flailing as he tried to regain balance, and instinct took over, his hands shooting out to grab his friend's jacket, fingers closing desperately around fabric that felt suddenly too thin, too fragile to hold against the pull from below. For a moment they teetered there together, suspended between surfaces, the crack gaping beneath them like a mouth that did not hurry because it knew time was on its side, and in that suspended instant he saw something in his friend's eyes that chilled him more deeply than the cold ever could, not fear, not terror, but recognition, as though the thing beneath the cabin had just reminded him of something he had forgotten. "I remember this," his friend whispered, the words slipping out unguarded. "I've been here before." The statement made no sense, and yet it resonated with a horrible inevitability, because as he looked at his friend he began to notice subtle changes that had not been there moments earlier, small discrepancies accumulating too quickly to ignore, the way his friend's breath no longer fogged the air despite the cold, the way the green light of the aurora reflected off his eyes with a glassy smoothness that lacked depth, the way his posture shifted, relaxing even as the floor continued to give way beneath them, and when his friend smiled, slow, uncertain, almost apologetic, understanding struck him with brutal clarity, the realization that the lake did not take people violently, did not drag them screaming beneath the ice, but rather reintroduced them to a place they already knew, coaxing out a memory embedded so deeply it felt like instinct. The hands emerged then, pale and slick, pushing up through the split floorboards in clusters, fingers curling around exposed edges of wood and wrenching them apart with a strength that did not match their thinness, and as the opening widened he caught glimpses of movement below, shapes pressed close together, shifting and realigning as if preparing for a transfer, and the sound that rose with them was not the frantic splashing he had imagined but a low, unified hum, the same vibration they had felt earlier, now amplified and layered, a resonance that filled the cabin and made thought difficult, urging surrender through sheer persistence. He tried to pull his friend back again, muscles straining, but his grip slipped as water slicked the fabric, and his friend did not fight him, did not struggle or cry out, but instead reached up and touched his wrist gently, the contact cold enough to burn. "It's easier," his friend said softly. "Down there, it's all the same temperature." The absurdity of the statement nearly broke him, because it carried a terrible logic, an invitation framed as relief rather than threat, and in that moment he understood the mechanism fully, the way the lake exploited exhaustion and isolation, the way it offered sameness in place of friction, stillness in place of effort, and he realized that it did not need to convince people so much as remind them of how tired they already were. The hum intensified, the aurora flaring outside as if in response, and the cabin lurched violently to one side, forcing a decision he had been desperately avoiding, and when his friend's weight shifted fully toward the opening, when his balance tipped irrevocably in favor of the pull below, he made the choice that would haunt him long after the night ended. He let go. The release was not dramatic. There was no scream, no final plea, only a sudden absence of resistance as his friend slipped from his grasp and vanished into the widening gap, the hands below receiving him with gentle efficiency, drawing him downward with a care that bordered on reverence, and as the opening sealed behind him with a wet, sucking sound, the hum dropped abruptly, cut off mid-vibration, plunging the cabin into a silence so complete it rang. The aurora dimmed outside, its green light fading to a faint smear at the horizon, and the floorboard settled back into place with a series of dull thuds, the fissure closing as if it had never existed, leaving behind warped wood and damp stains that told no coherent story of what had just occurred. He collapsed onto the floor, chest heaving, throat raw from breathing air that felt suddenly too thin, too sharp, and for a long time he lay there unable to move, unable to process the emptiness where his friend had been, because the mind resisted forming an image of that absence, insisted on treating it as temporary, reversible, and when sensation finally returned to his limbs and he dragged himself upright, the cabin looked unchanged in all the ways that mattered, the bed still in place, the table upright, the embers glowing quietly in the hearth as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and the ordinariness of it all felt like an accusation. Dawn came slowly. Gray light seeped in through the windows, revealing the cabin in full detail, the warped boards, the dampness along the seams of the floor, the single set of footprints leading to the door and none beside them, and as he stepped outside on unsteady legs the lake greeted him with deceptive calm, the ice smooth and unbroken, the fishing hole sealed over completely, its surface pristine, reflecting the pale sky without distortion, and when he scanned the lake's expanse for any sign of disturbance, any mark that might confirm the reality of what had happened, he found nothing, the surface offering no evidence of what lay beneath. A movement behind him made him turn. His friend stood on the snow near the cabin, alive, breathing, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee, concern etched into his familiar features as he asked whether he was all right, whether he had slept poorly, and the sight of him sent a shock through his system so violent he nearly retched, because it forced his mind to reconcile 2 incompatible truths, the certainty of what he had witnessed, and the undeniable presence of the person standing before him, and as his friend stepped closer, extending one of the mugs with a reassuring smile, he noticed the final detail that sealed his understanding, the detail that confirmed the lake had completed its exchange. The ice did not reflect his friend's breath. Steam rose from the coffee and vanished into the cold air, but his friend's exhale left no trace, no fog, no warmth, and as he accepted the mug with shaking hands, his friend's grip lingering on his shoulder a second too long, he understood that the lake had not taken his friend entirely, had not reduced him to one of the faces beneath the ice, but had repurposed him, returning a version that fit the surface world just well enough to pass, and as the cabin door closed behind them and the day fully claimed the sky, he realized that survival had come with a cost far greater than death, because the thing that walked beside him now knew how to live above the ice, and whatever remained below was still waiting for its turn to be remembered. He stayed. That was the first choice he made after dawn, and it surprised him how little it felt like a decision at all, because leaving would have required explanation, movement, a confrontation with a world that expected a story with clean edges and survivable truths, whereas staying, at least for a while, allowed the shock to settle into something quieter, something that resembled routine, and so when his friend suggested they pack up later, after things warmed a little, after coffee, after they got their bearings, he nodded and followed him back into the cabin without comment, the door closing behind them with a familiar wooden thud that sounded wrong only because it sounded normal. The cabin no longer smelled like deep water. That absence unsettled him more than the smell itself ever had, because it implied completion, a task finished neatly enough that no residue was required, and as they moved through the small space together, his friend stoking the fire, setting mugs on the table, commenting idly on the weather, he watched for signs of difference, for cracks in the performance, but found none that would satisfy him, none that could be pointed to without sounding unhinged, because his friend moved with the same habits, spoke with the same cadence, remembered the same shared jokes and minor grievances, and when he laughed the sound carried the same warmth it always had, filling the cabin in a way that felt almost cruel in its accuracy. It was only in the small, unguarded moments that the discrepancies revealed themselves. His friend never seemed to need to sit down. He would lean, stand, shift his weight, but never fully rest, as if the concept of fatigue existed only in theory. He did not complain about the cold, though the temperature inside the cabin remained low enough that breath still fogged faintly in the air, and when he stepped outside to gather the remaining gear, his movements left impressions in the snow that appeared shallower than they should have been, as if his weight did not translate fully into the surface beneath him. These were details that could be dismissed individually, rationalized as quirks of exhaustion or perception, but together they formed a pattern that pressed against the edges of the narrator's awareness, a constant, quiet reminder that whatever stood beside him now was not entirely subject to the same rules. They left the cabin in late morning. The drive back was uneventful, the road cleared enough to make travel easy, the radio crackling with ordinary broadcasts that felt almost obscene in their cheerfulness, hosts laughing about resolutions and fresh starts, callers sharing plans for the year ahead, and as the landscape slid past the windows, snow-laden trees, frozen fields, the occasional distant structure half buried in white, he found himself studying his friend's reflection in the glass, noting how it lagged slightly behind the movement of the car, how the image seemed less anchored, less certain of its place, and yet when he looked directly at him, the effect vanished, replaced by the familiar presence he had known for years. They did not speak of the night. The silence around it grew quickly, reinforced by the absence of evidence, by the way the lake had erased its own interruption, sealing the ice so flawlessly that there was no mark to point to and say here, this is where something went wrong, and without that anchor the memory began to feel dangerously malleable, subject to reinterpretation, to the slow erosion of doubt, and he wondered more than once whether this was part of the exchange, whether the lake did not simply replace bodies but softened recollections, sanding down the sharp edges until only a vague sense of unease remained, easy to live with, easy to ignore. Weeks passed. Life resumed its shape, responsibilities reasserting themselves with relentless efficiency, and his friend slipped back into routines with a smoothness that bordered on impressive, answering messages promptly, showing up early, engaging with people in ways that made them feel seen and valued, and though no one remarked on the change explicitly, he noticed how others responded to him now, gravitating toward him more readily, lingering longer in conversation, as if something about him had become more aligned with expectation, more attuned to the rhythms of surface life. Watching this produced a conflicted mix of relief and dread, because while the familiarity of his friend's presence eased the ache of loss, the improvement suggested intention, a calibration that implied the lake did not merely return what it took, but optimized it. The dreams began in February. They were always the same at their core, though details shifted from night to night, and they always began with stillness, with him standing on the ice under a starless sky, the surface beneath his feet smooth and flawless, reflecting nothing, and in that stillness came the sound, soft at first, then growing clearer, the tapping, the measured rhythm he now recognized as speech in its earliest form, and when he knelt and pressed his ear to the ice, voices rose up to meet him, layered and calm. Speaking not in words but in sensations, memories surfacing unbidden, moments of exhaustion and surrender from across his life, and in the dream he always felt the same temptation, the same pull toward the idea of rest without friction, of existing at a temperature where nothing changed abruptly, nothing demanded adaptation. He always woke before the ice broke. But he woke with the certainty that something beneath the surface was listening, tracking the cadence of his breath, learning him the way it had learned his friend. Spring came late that year. When the thaw finally arrived, it did so unevenly, patches of open water appearing on lakes across the region while others remained stubbornly sealed, and when news broke of a reservoir not far from the cabin flooding unexpectedly, exposing old foundations and debris long submerged, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a recognition that went beyond coincidence, and he drove there alone one gray afternoon, standing at the edge of the water and watching as sunlight penetrated depths that had not seen it in decades, and though there were no faces pressed against the surface now, no hands reaching up, he felt the same pressure behind his eyes, the same low-frequency hum vibrating faintly through the ground beneath his feet. He understood then what the lake kept. Not people, not exactly. Patterns. Rhythms of breath and fatigue, the shape of longing and the memory of weight, all stored patiently beneath the surface until conditions were right, until the barrier thinned and the exchange could occur again, and in that understanding came a final, quiet horror, because it meant the lake did not need to hunt or lure, did not need to act with urgency or cruelty, it simply waited for the right alignment of cold and time and human weariness. And when that alignment arrived, it answered. He stopped going north after that. avoided frozen water whenever possible, chose routes that favored movement over stillness, and yet even in summer, even standing beside warm rivers that flowed too quickly to hold anything long, he sometimes felt the phantom sensation of ice beneath his feet, the echo of tapping carried up through stone and memory, and on those nights, when sleep came reluctantly, he would listen to his friend's breathing in the next room, steady and unbroken, and wonder whether the thing that had returned from beneath the ice dreamed at all, or whether it simply remembered. On the last night of the year, nearly 12 months after the cabin, he stood alone by a small, frozen pond in a city park, fireworks beginning to bloom faintly in the distance, their muffled echoes carrying across the cold air, and as the countdown reached its final seconds he pressed his boot lightly against the ice, feeling its resistance, its smooth, deceptive strength, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he felt something answer from below, a gentle tap that aligned perfectly with the rhythm of the counting crowd, and when the year turned and the cheers rose around him, he stepped back quickly, heart racing, knowing with absolute certainty that the lake did not need to take him tonight, did not need to hurry, because it already knew his name, and it had all the time in the world to decide when to call it again. The static returned slowly this time, not in a rush, not like something breaking, but like a tide easing its way back onto the shore. Somewhere beneath it, a clock continues to tick, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to remind you that time never truly stops, it only pretends to for our benefit. If you're still awake, the voice says softly, closer now, as if leaning toward the microphone, then you made it through another threshold. A pause. The faint sound of wind brushing against glass. Tonight, we followed 3 paths. A frozen highway that refused to forget a promise. A celebration where time decided who belonged where. And a lake that learned how to give something back, just convincingly enough. The static deepens, then settles. What ties these stories together isn't death. It isn't monsters. It's something quieter than that. It's the idea that certain moments don't end when we think they do. That some places remember us longer than we remember them. And that midnight, real midnight, isn't just a time on a clock, it's a point of alignment. Another pause. Longer this time. So before you sleep, listen. The clock ticks once more. Listen to the sound of your own breathing. To the weight of the room around you. To the places you've been that might still be listening back. A faint hum, almost imperceptible, treads through the silence. If something knocks tonight, if a reflection lingers a second too long, if a memory feels colder than it should, don't panic. Not everything that reaches out wants to hurt you. The voice lowers. Some things just want to be remembered. The static begins to fade. Thank you for keeping me company in the dark. This has been Dread Shadow. Wherever you are, whatever year you've stepped into. One last tick. Good night. And don't rush the morning. The radio exhales, and goes quiet.